All right. Okay, so as you can see, the title of the article that I'm going to talk about is The Role of Self-Control Strength in the Relation Between Anxiety and Cognitive Performance. So they're specifically looking at test anxiety and how that affects performance on tests. So there's pretty inconsistent evidence overall that test anxiety actually impairs test performance. There are some articles that have found that people with high test anxiety do perform worse on tests, but then there are some that have found that there's really no difference no matter what your level of anxiety is. So there's no real consensus in the field about how exactly that all works. And these authors thought that maybe self-regulation, or as they call it here, self-control, might have a factor in that relationship. And basically they're following the strength model, which says that essentially there's a pool of resources that everyone has, and you use these self-control resources whenever you're doing basically anything that requires executive functioning. So it could be things as diverse as if you're trying to avoid dessert when you're on a diet, or if your roommate's playing music and you're trying to focus on your homework. Those are both, with this model, drawing upon the same pool of resources. And that's a finite pool, so it does replenish over time, but if you're using a lot at once it's gone, and you're going to have a really hard time overriding your impulses and things like that. So bringing these ideas together, their general hypothesis for this article was that the impact of anxiety on performance will be moderated by self-control, because they say that when your working memory is being used up thinking about how am I going to do on this test, what's going to happen if I fail, things like that, you have less of your working memory and fewer resources for focusing on attention, and you need those resources or focusing on the test, and you need those resources to push aside worries and just concentrate on the task in front of you. And they had 3 different studies within this one article. So this first one, their basic hypothesis was that higher state anxiety, so higher amounts of anxiety that you're feeling in the moment during the test, will predict lower verbal performance, but only in participants who are ego depleted, or that means those who have used up most of their self-control resources. So that would mean that in participants who had a big pool of resources to draw from, anxiety wouldn't really make a difference in their test performance, but it would if they didn't have those resources. So for this method, what they did first was their self-control manipulation. So they had both groups of participants write an account of something that happened to them during their day. And the control group just wrote it as normal, no further directions. And the experimental group, which was the one they were depleting the resources from, had to write it while omitting the letters E and N. And that depletes your self-control resources because you have to override your impulse to just habitually spell out words. You have to actually think when you're writing and not just go on your automatic processing. So they did that, and then they both groups took a state anxiety measure, just seeing in that exact moment how nervous were they feeling, things like that. And then the actual test for this purpose was memorizing 15 nonsense syllables, so just, they weren't words, but just different sounds. And they had 1 minute to do that. Then they were distracted for a brief period, and they had to then recall as many of those syllables as they could. And the statistical analyses that the authors used were multiple regression analysis. So they took the participants' performance on the verbal task, and they regressed it on experimental condition, amount of state anxiety, and the interaction between those two variables. And they found a significant interaction between experimental condition and level of anxiety, such that state anxiety predicted performance on the test, so it predicted the amount of syllables you were able to recall, but only for participants in the depletion condition, so only for participants who had to omit the E's and N's when they were writing. And so basically their higher state anxiety in that case correlated with recalling fewer syllables. So this study goes and supports their initial hypothesis that self-control would play an important role in that relationship. And then they did a very similar study for the second one, except this time they measured math performance instead of verbal performance. So they had a similar hypothesis that higher state anxiety would predict lower math performance in the depleted participants. They had a very similar method, except instead of the verbal test, what they did was they gave them a bunch of multiplication problems, and they had 3 minutes to solve as many as they could just in their head. And they just had to try to solve as many as they could get through in 3 minutes. And the statistical analyses were similar to the ones used in study 1. The results were a little bit different, though. They found a significant main effect of experimental condition, meaning that participants in the depletion condition, regardless of anxiety, were able to solve fewer problems than participants in the control condition. And then they also found that the interaction between experimental condition and anxiety approached significance. So state anxiety marginally predicted performance in the depletion condition only. In the non-depletion condition, it was nowhere near significant. So since this was essentially a replication of the first study, they took these results as supporting their hypothesis as well, since they found that, in general, higher state anxiety correlated with a lower math performance. And then for study 3, they changed things up a bit, and they decided to focus on trait test anxiety, which is not how you're feeling in the moment, but more dispositionally, how anxious do you feel during tests and situations like that. So their hypothesis, the main one was that worries related to level of trait anxiety would distract depleted participants more than the control participants. And they believed that the amount of distraction by your worries that you experienced would lead to lower performance on the same math procedure as was in the last one. So for this method, they gave everyone first trait anxiety inventory, just seeing generally how anxious do they get. Then the manipulation for this study was pretty interesting. They had to watch a silent video of a woman being interviewed. So she's just talking, but you can't hear anything that she's saying. And then popping up on the screen are just different random words. And the control group was just told, watch the video, we'll ask you some questions at the end. And the experimental group that was depleting their self-control resources was told, watch the video, but do not look at the words on the bottom. And if you find yourself looking there, divert your attention right back to the woman. And that's pretty difficult because we naturally, when there's a novel stimulus, want to divert our attention to that. So it takes a lot of energy to be able to focus on something that's getting kind of boring versus something new that's popping up. So then after that, they did the same multiplication task as in the last study. And then finally, they rated how distracted they were by worries during the test. So it was just a Likert scale, and they subjectively said, I was very distracted, I was not very distracted, things like that. For the analyses for this study, the authors used a moderated mediation model. And they found that the interaction between trait anxiety and condition significantly impacted the degree of perceived distraction by worries, so that high levels of worry predicted more distraction in the depletion condition, but in the control condition, participants reported equal levels of distraction regardless of how dispositionally worried they were. And they also found that the amount of worry in the depletion condition affected test performance, so participants who were more worried performed worse. And this relationship was mediated by distraction by worries. So distraction was the mechanism that related worrying about a test with poorer performance on the test. So in all, these 3 studies come together to support their general hypothesis that self-regulation is the moderating factor in the relationship between the amount of test anxiety and test performance. And this is important because it fills some gaps in the test anxiety literature, because we do have these disparate studies that are saying different things. So perhaps that one of the factors in getting all these different results is that maybe in some studies the authors were unintentionally depleting their participants' self-control resources, or just had participants who were coming in having used up more, and that was affecting the results, and without that even being taken into account, and that would make state anxiety affect test performance in a way that maybe they hadn't anticipated in different studies. And similarly, it provides a mechanism for the relationship between working memory and test anxiety. So as I said before, it takes a lot of memory, of your working memory, to have to focus on both the test and the anxiety you're feeling. So maybe self-regulation might be something that helps explain that relationship. And then finally, it provides a basis for the development of practical interventions for test anxiety, because according to the strength model, the one that this article was based on, you can increase the amount of self-control resources you have. So it's kind of like a muscle where if you work it out, then it will get bigger, and the more you use your self-control resources, the more you have in the end. So it could be that training people to increase their self-control resources might help them overcome their test anxiety and have it not affect their test performance as much. So that's an exciting practical aspect of this paper. And then here's my reference. Thank you.
I may have missed it, but for the math, like in study 2, was the depletion task the same as in the verbal, or was it different?
It was the same as in the verbal, so it was the writing and omitting the E and N, yeah.
Do you know about how anxious the people in the study reported they were? Because I imagine they're a lot more anxious in an actual test setting in school than they would be for this study.
Yeah, I was actually, off the top of my head, I don't know how anxious they were, but that's in other articles, because I'm doing some research on test anxiety for my senior research, and other articles have found it very difficult to induce that kind of anxiety in a lab condition like this, because, like you said, it's not a real test. The participants know on some level it doesn't really matter, but it seems like they were able to do it here.
Folks here have done some reading from Roy Bellman's work. We have a couple of professors who have had seminars where they've used his books. Dr. Brickman has used his book, I believe, and Dr. Andrea Laurie has used his book, and other writing from John Metzger on self-control and depletion. Has anybody had such a course? Did you have some exposure to that?
Yeah, I took Dr. Laurie's self-regulation seminar last fall, okay. So that's where I first learned about all this.
Yeah. All right, we have one more round of applause to thank you. Let me draw the line there, and we'll look forward to seeing you all on Wednesday at 8:30.